Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the QKZ collaboration with Hawaii Bad Boy on a set called Khan. It, of course, is a high-performance dual dynamic driver in-ear earphone, as they say on the cover of it. So what that just means is that there's actually two dynamic drivers in there. But as we take a close-up look at it, it's a very, very nice shell. A little resin inset there with the Hawaii Bad Boy logo. And on the back, it's almost a translucent style back. You can see one dynamic driver there. I don't think you can get a great look at the other one without a flashlight or some more lighting. Other thing to note on this guy is this nozzle. It's a little bit long and maybe a lot of bit wide. It definitely will shred up an ear tip if you're not careful. It is wider than your standard, and it's really hard to see on video how wide it is, but it is quite wide, so be very, very careful about pulling off your tips and putting them on. If you try to grab the edge of the little inset stem, it will tend to rip them, so be very careful on that. This is the other side, and it just has a QKZ logo instead of the Hawaii Bad Boy logo. So additionally, you get a commemorative coin, which is there, and this really nice QKZ. This is actually a hard plastic case, which you don't see too often. Inside, tips and cable. For those of you who may have watched my Heyday review, I talked about that cable quite a lot. That is the cable I use on this guy. I never actually opened it. Tips I actually use from Heyday also, the KB07. And as I said, KB07 actually fits fine on here. Just be really careful about pulling them off. So let's kind of jump right into it, and we'll kind of start there. So potential titles I didn't use on this video: Khan but not forgotten, controversy, and I won't talk about the kind of what those mean, but it's just kind of a reminder that this YouTube is one platform that we watch reviews. There are other platforms that people use. I use Facebook, Discord, Headfi, Hi-Fi Guys. There's lots of places to get involved with the community and reach out to reviewers and reach out to guys like Hawaii Bad Boy and see what their opinions are, see what they talk about on, a daily basis in between reviews. So if you want to figure out what the drama was over one night, that's a pretty good place to go look for things like that. Better than Truth Ear Zero. I don't really know because I never heard the Truth Ear Zero. So I couldn't really tell you if it's better or not, but one thing that I always remembered from Truth Ear Zero, and I don't get sets super quick like Timmy at Giz Audio does, but his graph actually showed probably the closest of Khan. So his Khan is in blue, his Truth Ear Zero is in green, and his graph tended to show them pretty close. The base level, we'll talk about that in a little bit and how that can actually change and why his may show probably a 2 or 3 decibel higher than what Critical's may show. My Khan is actually in red, and it actually matches his quite well. So I don't know why it's really hard to pick out where the exact changes are. I think originally Hawaii Bad Boy talked about a little increase in bass, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And then he really relaxed the treble. And I think this is exactly where you really see the change. And you see it on sort of all three of these. So he definitely relaxed the pin again and pushed it out a little bit. You can see the original Truth Ear Zero came up a little earlier, a little bit sharper. And you can actually see the 2 green peaks there. So if you change the tuning on the nozzle, something in front of the driver, it tends to flatten these guys out. They'll kind of drop in and form one peak, and that's exactly what you see what happened on Khan. So I do believe that this is probably the bigger change. How much change happened on the bass is probably depending on what source you're using. We'll get to that in a second, but I do think this is probably the major bit of it, just relaxing this bit and pushing the pin again. So it's a little more relaxed, a little more easygoing. That's exactly the style that I like and probably why I would prefer Khan over Zero. But as I said, I don't have Zero, so I don't know. But Khan I do know, and Khan is right up my alley. So what I noticed first about Khan, bass control, the stage and the imaging, and vocal clarity. So I think people get caught up on the bass. It's got 2 dynamic drivers. The bass is going to be amazing. What I will say is the 2 things that I actually bolded are the two things that I actually noticed sort of right away. The two things that I think differentiate Khan from a lot of other sets that are in the same price range. And they're not the bass. The bass is good, we'll get to that, but the experience is very good for the price. And by experience, I mean beyond bass levels and treble levels, the tuning and the stage presentation and how smooth it is end to end, that experience, that overall engaging experience that is fun and invites you in and makes you want to listen for longer, that's exactly what Khan does very, very well. And hard to do at this price. Lots of sets sort of have rough spots. This one doesn't have a rough spot. And this overall higher level experience is sort of right on. Very much appealing to me. Second, so as I said, I like the bass, but I really stayed for the natural mids. BL03 fans, guys who have listened to other Hawaii Bad Boy tune sets, you sort of know that he has a style on the midsection that is sort of a more full sound, a more natural sound. Again, kind of what exactly you're getting on Khan. And I actually preferred that over the bass. Not the bass, there's anything wrong with it, but what actually pulled me in and the tracks that I kept on listening to are more vocal-centric and not bass-centric. So, yeah. So, kind of surprised me. I thought, like everyone else, I'd be kind of really into the bass and be, subwoofer, detached, all these things that you hear people described about. Those are things that I thought they were okay, but not what actually pulled me into Khan. Also, what surprised me, people who are calling it dark and not as energetic and not as engaging. I think some tracks can have too much bass and maybe it leans that way, but as far as, a set sounding weighed down or really kind of blunted attack, I don't get that on this set at all. So I wasn't really sure what source was going on, what tracks they were using. I do think that it is a bit track sensitive, but maybe they're listening at a lower volume. But there's also another thing involved that we'll talk about right now. So the design is sensitive to impedance, not just adapters. I have impedance adapters, but source itself. So two sources that I have handy. I almost always measure with ES100, so RAS1 ES100. That is a low impedance device. It is well below 1 ohm. So that gives you sort of the more traditional looking measurement that you see what other people are doing. TRI is TK2. That is a high impedance source. So again, no adapter, just straight up different source that I was using. That is a high impedance, well over 1. I think it may go up to 10 ohms, so a high impedance. But still less than what you would get with a normal adapter, which I think 20 is about the more popular one that you see. So even about 10 ohms is actually going to get you quite a bit bump. That's almost 5 dB right about there. So is that the difference between what people's impressions are? Maybe they're using a high impedance source. It's a little bassier. Maybe it comes off a bit darker. Not really clear, but for me, I don't think Khan even approaches a dark description. So sound-wise, bassy, relaxed. The mids retain clarity, which is surprising. And again, I'll talk to mids a lot. It's the more surprising bit of it to me than the bass. And I think the clarity that you get and the detail that you get is surprising and sort of why you would head towards a hybrid design as opposed to a single dynamic driver anyway. So I think it all worked out the way it was supposed to work out. So the bass, again, the hardest part to describe as there aren't many examples at this price point. And I think people tend to gravitate. It's like two dynamic drivers. One's going to sound detached like a subwoofer should. It sounds like a 2.1 home theater. I don't get all of that. I would say it sounds like a high quality, high quantity dynamic driver. It's a dynamic driver that can handle a pretty high level of bass and do it very well, very controlled, still lots of definition, and that's really hard to find at this price point. Typically what you're hearing is a high level of bass with a lot of bloat to it. And bloat for me is sort of this halo around notes. It tends to make bass sound like a kind of a one note. There's not really any definition to it. There's no texture to it. It sounds big and fun, but you're not actually hearing, any detail to it all. It just sounds kind of like a big halo around each note. What you get on Khan is sort of a higher level, but still retaining that definition and detail and texture. And again, I call that a high quality, high dynamic driver. I mean, I don't know, maybe it sounds detached. I don't really know. But for me, it's more of a better melee or Kai. You really have that slam, but the rest of it is better for me. And I think this is the hybrid design sort of filled out the maybe the drawbacks of melee and Kai. I think melee was a great one dynamic driver that did the low end very, very well. There's almost nothing that had a better dynamic driver to handle bass the way that one slams. The rest of it, is kind of okay. And I think Khan actually fills out that bit. It's kind of slams like melee, but the mids and the treble are definitely in the sweet spot for me, as opposed to I would point those as nitpicks on melee. So the level may not be everyone's preference, right? It's still a lot. I mean, depending on your source, you can't really wave your hand over this graph and say, well, it doesn't really sound as bassy that it does. At some point, you're going to hit some track where it's going to sound exactly like that. It's kind of a bassy, it can't be a bassy fun side. So that's not going to be for everyone. But if you're a Blonde fan, like I said, BL03 fans, you're kind of right there in the sweet spot of what you like to hear. So a track like Mac Miller, Smile Back, PA Nights, anything from Blue Sky Park, again, slammy, subwoofer-y-ish, but the vocal focus is kind of where it should be. And when people talk about that detached bit, having a lot of bass, a lot of slam without it affecting vocals, I think it comes through on tracks like that, and his voice sounds really, really good, very natural. And like I said, I know people like the bass, but I sort of am more attracted to what's going on with his voice than the actual bass, lower bass, sub bass that's actually happening in tracks like that. So the mids, and I guess this is where I would say the two drivers, the hybrid, it's where you see the benefits of it and also see some of the problems with it. And I think due to that bass level, you still need to think about your preferences on bass versus mids. Tracks that have a little bit of bass where you're not expecting it to really rise up and be dominant, I think that can happen, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. But you just have to have that in mind. Or if you get annoyed or distracted by bass levels, I think this one may be a challenge on some tracks, on genres that aren't really used to having high levels of bass. But at the same time, I will say it actually does it pretty well. So do be aware of that. And as I said, I sort of like the bass, but I really stayed for the natural mids. That relaxed pin again that we talked about, it's always more natural for me. And whether you talk about HRTF or how tuners can tune to their ears, how they hear vocals, how Hawaii Bad Boy hears vocals, how I hear vocals, there's just some sets that it just feels right. The gears are interlocking and everything sounds exactly the way it should be. And that's sort of what happens on Khan for me. Then there's other sets that are just a little too bright, and it's like two gears that aren't quite in lockstep, and they kind of grind against each other, and that's what those sound like to me. But whether it was Melee or Kai or Khan, I think the way he hears vocals are actually very close to how I prefer to hear vocals and how I hear them. So it always sounds a little more natural to me, and probably why I like this set quite a bit, maybe more than other people will. So on the good side, not surprising, balanced rock. Supertramp's Take the Long Way Home. Listen to this song over and over again. It's just big and open. Vocals are clear. The imaging is kind of big and wide, very precise. Everything that I wanted to hear at this price point is all there in that one track. Sure, it could use a little bit more weight. I don't think it really needs it, but that big, energetic, engaging, all the way into the treble, imaging and space, everything is kind of right on in that song. And again, that's sort of along with his library, so not too surprising that track actually does very well on this set. Not as good. So here's sort of where I talk about that bass level where you're expecting the bass to be a little lower than the mids. And a track like Holly Cole Trio, I can see clearly now that bass just kind of runs right up into her vocals, and it's distractingly bassy. Again, it's a track that it actually has quite a bit of bass, but you're not expecting it to really rise. It really feeds into that mid bass bump. It just, her vocals still sound clear, but it kind of really runs right up there. But then you listen to Walk on the Wild Side by Lou Reed, which is sort of the similar format. It's just, him singing with a bass in the back, but it doesn't rise up nearly as much as it does on her track. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly when it will and when it won't. Holly Culture, I sort of went out to seek that song because I knew it was going to be a problem just by looking at the graph. Lou Reed just sounds better the way it's mixed and recorded, and so just be aware of it. Not too much you can do other than to really think about it in your preferences. But the hybrid surprise, right? So why hybrids? Why you have two dynamic drivers? You have two dynamic drivers to sound better than one dynamic driver on its own. And I think for me, this was sort of the surprise. And it's not actually a surprise if you watch Hawaii Bad Boy's videos enough, because he talks about Vivaldi quite a bit. I choose to talk about the Richter version. This is Spring 1. And it's actually surprisingly good, surprisingly engaging. A lot of it is because of that space, the relaxed treble. It's not dark at all. Everything sort of sounds the way it should. And as I said, not too surprising because he talks about it, but sure, about halfway through, the bass will rise up just a little bit too far, but the stage and the imaging, just tons of fun. Maybe with the contrast and range, it sounds more like a sub bass, but that level on the strings is right on for me. And I didn't really expect it to be. As I said, should expect it since he talks about it, but I didn't expect it. Treble-wise, that delayed, relaxed rise into lower treble is right on for me, like we talked about. Check your preferences. I prefer it that way, but if you prefer more energetic, lower treble, then do pay attention to that. But it does bring a sense of seamless transition, and again, it's just really harder to find that price point. Even if the level is not to your preferences, you can really appreciate how smooth that goes from your mids all the way into the treble, the way it's sort of relaxed and brought down a little bit. And for me, it really created a gap between the other dynamic driver sets that I've talked about recently, C2 and C3 and Cadenza, Warner, all of those had small nitpick issues right in that area. Khan sort of really handles it well. Plus it has bass, plus it has detail. For me, I would have preferred to have Khan before any of those were released, and I probably wouldn't have talked about any of those. I think Khan does sort of made me forget about all those other sets for that simple reason. Non-fatiguing, forgiving, smooth extension as you want in dynamic drive treble. So deadmau5's strobe, the OV version, again, imaging is really strong. It's just smooth. And strings do have that bite in the first half. Again, I sort of point back to why people were talking about it being dark and too much bass. But when you really, really listen to it, I think everything sounds kind of the way it should sound. Sure, the second half, again, that bass level sort of rises a little higher than it should. And if you're thinking that there's not really enough air, if you look at the graph, listening to this guy at the stage and the imaging is really hard to pull that off without enough upper treble. And this one sort of nails that level because it's, again, lower treble brought down, not blocking anything happening in upper treble. And you do get the air and imaging and the height in the stage. Everything is there as it should be. So you can certainly point to the graph and say it's not enough, but when you listen to it, it's all there. So stage, again, I'm not going to keep talking about how good it is, but it's very good. Turn up the volume, listen to AC/DC's Thunderstruck, and be happy. So that is what I got on Khan. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.